We will be starting shortly in a few moments, everybody. Thank you for signing in. We're just waiting for a few more participants to join. Okay. I think we will get started. It's 10 in the morning now. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the Therapeutic Webinars CBT stream. I hope everyone is keeping as safe and as healthy as possible over the course of the pandemic. My name is Dr. Lisa Jewett, and I'm a psychologist with the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, or CBT service at the Jewish General Hospital. I will be speaking with you today for the next half an hour or so about what cognitive behavioral therapy is and how it can be applied to help common mental health problems like depression. I am joined today by my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Foley, who will be helping me moderate and answer some of your questions and comments later on. As you've seen, we have muted all of the participants for the course of the webinar just to reduce any background noise or to reduce the chance for audio issues during the webinar. And for the sake of ease, we are asking that given the number of participants today, that when you answer a question or if you have a question for us, that you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel screen. So if you click on the Q&A button, it should open a chat box, and you can just type in your questions there or your comments, and Dr. Foley and I will do our best to answer them all at the end of the webinar when we have time saved for question and answer. Okay. Now, before we get started, I just want to quickly go over an important disclaimer with you all about the therapeutic webinars. Importantly, these webinars are not meant to be clinical encounters, but rather informational sessions where we as presenters can provide you with helpful tips or tools to manage some of the issues you might be facing over the course of the pandemic. As such, presenters, including myself, are not able to provide individualized input or feedback to you as participants. We also please ask that you respect the privacy and confidentiality of other participants if questions or comments are asked. We will also not tolerate any violence or discrimination of any kind. If a presenter is to deem that anyone's participation is inappropriate in this manner, then we may ask that person to leave the webinar or remove them. Lastly, we are not able to address any acute safety concerns within the context of these webinars. If you're feeling unsafe within yourself, please leave the webinar and contact a crisis line such as Track Home, whose number I've listed here on the slide, or ultimately dial 911. We thank you very much for your understanding and your cooperation with these points. Okay, so what is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT? CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and it's an approach that's based on the idea that how we think, or our cognitions, how we feel, or our emotions, and how we act, or our behaviors, all interact and influence one another. And this can be represented in a form of a triangle, as shown here on the right of the slide, with connections between each part to show how they all interrelate. So for instance, we know that what we think affects both how we act and how we feel, that what we do also affects how we think and how we feel, and that what we feel affects how we think and what we do. As a quick example, imagine that someone has the thought that I'm useless and nobody likes me. That person might understandably feel things like sadness, loneliness, or depression, and that person may respond with behaviors such as isolation or withdrawing in themselves, showing how there's a link among thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in this case. I'm going to go more in depth in this webinar of some specific examples of how these interconnections among thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all play out. But it's important to note that at one time or another, we all can get stuck in negative or unhelpful patterns of thinking and behaving that affect our mood, especially during times of increased stress, such as the current context of COVID-19. But what we know is that just as much as we can develop negative patterns amongst our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, we can also make changes to this area in order to feel better. It's generally easier to work directly on changing our thoughts and our behaviors rather than our emotions. So this is where we typically start in CBT, using our emotions to guide us in how we're doing, kind of like a temperature gauge on a thermometer. For instance, if I were to ask you all to just stop feeling sad or anxious about the current pandemic, how likely would it be that you could all simply stop feeling those things just by me asking you directly? Probably not very likely. It might be nice, but probably not that realistic. On the other hand, if I were to say, let's look at what you're thinking and how you're reacting to the situation, we would have a much better chance of this working, and we would use your emotions to see how we're doing. Do I feel more or less sad after changing the way that I might be thinking or reacting? So this is what we try to do with CBT. We try to help people become more aware of when they are applying unhelpful or negative styles of thinking that affect mood, behavior, and even physical states, what's happening inside our bodies. Then, using CBT strategies, a person can learn to recognize negative patterns among their own thoughts and replace them with more balanced ways of thinking, with the ultimate goal to reduce emotional distress. At the same time, CBT can help folks change patterns of behaviors that also come from unhelpful thinking and that can impact mood. Using CBT principles, we can also become a little bit more aware of how we might be appraising situations or our perspective on certain things, and asking ourselves if our thoughts in that situation are helpful to us or if they're more unhelpful or even harmful. So in order to explain this CBT model in more detail, I'm now going to use the mental health problem of depression as an example to illustrate the links among our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It's important here to distinguish the difference between normal feelings of sadness or feeling down or blue with the diagnosis of depression. We all feel sad at times and experience those kinds of emotions, and we may be experiencing them with more frequency these days given COVID-19 and all of the ramifications. But when we're talking about a diagnosis of depression, we're really referring to a specific set of symptoms that are present more days than not for at least a 2-week period. Some of these symptoms include feeling down, sad, losing interest in things that you used to enjoy doing, oftentimes feeling slowed down, lack of energy, fatigued, problems with concentrating or focusing, appetite or sleep changes, and oftentimes excessive feelings of guilt or even worthlessness, among a few others. So we can see how in depression, there is an impact on all parts of that CBT triangle, the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, as well as even the physiological states like fatigue, appetite, and sleep. Dr. Aaron Beck, who is one of the founders of CBT, described a cognitive triad of types of negative thinking that are typically associated with symptoms of depression. And he categorized these into what I've shown here on the slide: negative views of the self, negative views of the world, and negative views of the future that typically have a more critical, hopeless, or helpless quality about them. An example of a depressive thought related to negative views of the self might be, I am worthless. An example of a depressive kind of thought related to negative views of the world or other people might be, nobody loves me. And a depressive style of thinking associated with the future could be, I am hopeless because it will always be this way. Let's go now a little bit more in depth into the CBT model for depression and look at an example of how negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all interact and influence one another for someone with depression. For this example, let's say we're talking about a middle-aged man who has symptoms of depression and who is waking up in the morning to get ready to go into work. He might have thoughts such as, I'm too tired to get up. My job is a dead-end job anyway, what's the point? And my coworkers don't even like me. Now, understandably, these thoughts might lead this man to experience emotions like frustration, sadness, or even hopelessness. We can add here to the feelings physiological reactions that he might also be experiencing in his body, like feeling fatigued or really tired, lethargic, or slowed down. The man then responds to these feelings and physiological reactions with behaviors such as staying in bed, eventually calling in sick to work, and not seeing his coworkers. So right away here, we can see the links among the man's initial negative thoughts, his subsequent feelings, and his behavioral reactions. We can then continue the model to see what then happens next after the man engaged in these initial behaviors of staying in bed, of calling in sick to work, and of isolating himself. Well, those behaviors may generate additional negative thoughts, such as, well, now I've wasted my entire day. I'm definitely never going to get the job that I want if I can't even get out of bed. And ultimately, I'm a failure. Not surprisingly, these thoughts then lead the man to experience even more negative emotions. And now we might have things like guilt being present, even more sadness, disappointment even, and even more hopelessness. These feelings then lead the man to engage in even further negative behavioral responses, like sleeping in, staying in bed longer, maybe watching more TV, and stopping to answer phone calls from family or friends, which kind of completes a sort of negative feedback loop where the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all perpetuated. So as we can see here, through no fault of our own at times, we can get stuck in these vicious cycles of patterns of thinking, feeling, and responding that get reinforced over time. With CBT, what we try to do is figure out what keeps us stuck in these vicious cycles and work to make changes to both our thinking and our actions to help us feel better, or in this case, to feel less depressed. So again, the idea here is that by changing the way that you think or changing the way that you act or respond, it can improve your mood. Okay. So now let's move into reviewing some ways that we can make changes to the way that we think to improve our mood, or in other words, as we call this in CBT, cognitive strategies. There are basically two steps involved in cognitive strategies to change the way that we think. The first is that we want to identify what are the negative thoughts or patterns of thoughts that we have. And then we want to work to evaluate our thoughts and see if we can generate alternative, more balanced or realistic thoughts. The kinds of thoughts that we have that tend to influence feelings and behaviors are often what we call automatic thoughts. And these can be words, they can be images or memories that just pop into our heads over the course of a given day. You can liken these to the pop-ups that you sometimes get on your computer screen when browsing the internet, right? You didn't ask for them to be there, nor do you necessarily want them, nor are they particularly useful, but yet they still appear with very little effort. You might even be having some automatic thoughts right now. Oh, this makes sense, or I hope this webinar is helpful to me, or why isn't she answering my question, or what might I have for lunch later? We all have thousands of different thoughts over the course of a given day. And sometimes our thoughts are positive thoughts. Sometimes they're very neutral thoughts. But a lot of the time, again, through no fault of our own, our thoughts can become biased towards the negative. And this is especially the case when we're talking about depression. If you remember the cognitive triad, that a lot of times depressive thinking tends to err on the side of more critical, hopeless, or helpless kinds of thoughts. So what we do with CBT, what we try to do, is help to develop more balanced and unbiased views of yourself, others, or your situation. Now, sometimes people make the suggestion, why don't you just try to think more positively? But in many situations, this isn't realistic because a positive thought may not be any more accurate than a negative thought. So in CBT, we aren't looking to just replace negative thoughts with positive thoughts, but rather to work on examining our thoughts as objectively as possible, much like a lawyer who evaluates evidence in a court of law, to try and come up with what's the most accurate, realistic, and unbiased viewpoint. Maybe we can use an example reflective of the current situation with COVID-19 to illustrate this. So I'm sure many of you right now are stuck at home with forced changes to pretty much every part of your life, your social life, your work life, your family life, school life for you, whether you're a student or you have kids at home. And a lot of this was done without your control. So understandably, you may be experiencing thoughts like, this is never going to end, or I can't take another day like this, or there's nothing I can do. And these thoughts understandably lead maybe to feelings of powerlessness or hopelessness or even despair. But by looking at these thoughts, we might be able to find different ways of thinking about the situation or a different perspective that could ultimately reduce some of those feelings of discouragement or hopelessness. I won't get into too much detail now about how to actually do that, although I'm sure many of you would like to go there. But that's because next week in our next CBT seminar, we're going to be dedicating the entire half an hour to exactly that, how you identify, challenge, and change negative or unhelpful thoughts. So please stay tuned for that. It is important here to note, and I want to make this point, that there is sometimes elements of truth to our negative thoughts. And that's certainly the case right now in the context of COVID-19. But a lot of the times, without us really being aware of it, our thoughts are oversimplifications or exaggerations of reality. And these are really the thoughts that we're talking about here and that we want to change by these cognitive strategies. It's really the biased or the unhelpful thoughts. Because by learning to see or experience our thoughts in a more balanced way, we can reduce the negative impact on our moods. Part of this will involve remembering that our thoughts are not necessarily facts, even though our mind might try to convince us of this often. But in fact, thoughts can be evaluated, challenged, and ultimately changed. Okay. So now that we have talked about the CBT concept of changing the way that we think, let's move now into how to improve our moods by changing the way that we act or respond. And this in CBT is referred to as a category of behavioral strategies. And this basically refers to engaging in behaviors that lift your mood. And this also is particularly important for symptoms of depression, because what we know is that with depression, people have a tendency to do less and less of the things that used to make them feel good, to become more lethargic, more withdrawn, and more isolated as well. So behavioral strategies are important for depression. We call these behavioral strategies, or one approach of this is called behavioral activation. And essentially this just means engaging, activating more. It does not necessarily mean doing more exercise, especially if it's not something that you already enjoy doing, although we know that some form of even light exercise can do wonders for boosting the mood. But no, behavioral activation really just means identifying activities for you that help to boost whether it's feelings of mastery or feelings of pleasure. So mastery activities would be ones that leave you with a feeling or a sense of accomplishment or productivity at the end. And pleasurable activities are those that just do that, that give us pleasure, that make us feel a positive mood boost. So I'll pause now here and invite you all to make some suggestions, type them into the Q&A box of what are some things that you have maybe already started doing that you feel boost your sense of mastery or pleasure right now? And I can read out a few ideas, or things perhaps that you would like to try to do in the future that maybe you haven't started yet, but that you think would help you to boost whether it's mastery or pleasure feelings. So feel free to just type any ideas in, brainstorm to the Q&A box, and I will see some suggestions if anyone wants to make any now. Oh, walking outside, absolutely. Yep. Cooking, yes. Cooking, art, doing artwork, dancing, great one. Great pleasurable feeling. Oh, a gratitude journal, that's a really nice idea. That's a really great idea as well. Some folks really find it helpful to note down what they're grateful for. Listening to music, yes. Attending musicals online. A lot of things are being put online now. You can attend musicals online. Learning a new language. Oh, these are great ideas. You folks have really been taking advantage. Yin, yoga, cooking, putting on makeup, exercising, absolutely. Singing, oh, we've got fantastic suggestions here. Writing to friends, baking, and improvement, seeing improvements in your own baking. That's even better. Watching a show, watching a favorite series, walking outside, absolutely. You guys have got it covered. So I'll just minimize that right now so I can continue with the slides, but those are exactly what we're talking about when we think of mastery and pleasure activities. So I put some examples on the slides here myself, but you all have clearly covered those. So really here, the takeaway point with behavioral activation strategies and mastery and pleasure activities is that we really want to just do more of the things that make us feel good and less of the things that make us feel bad. There is an important consideration when we are setting out behavioral activation goals, is that we want to set realistic expectations and realistic goals for ourselves. So if you know that, let's say, we had a few suggestions of doing exercise, walking outside. If you know that that boosts your mood, but you haven't really been very active over the course of the pandemic isolation period, maybe setting a goal of jogging 5 days a week right off the bat isn't the most realistic expectation for yourself. You want to be kind to yourself, but you also want to set a goal that you can absolutely reach. And this is really important when we're talking about depression, because if we set a goal that isn't realistic for us right now, and we aren't able to actually meet that goal, we run the risk of reinforcing some of those initial negative thoughts like, I'm not capable, I'm useless, which then actually enhance depressive feelings and make you far less likely to actually engage in those same activities that can make you feel better. So most important point with behavioral activation and mastery and pleasure goals is really to do something that you can attain and do right now. Just a quick point about some additional benefits of behavioral activation is that when we're doing something that makes us feel a sense of mastery or pleasure, it's also distracting us from a lot of our unhelpful ruminative thoughts. And this is very much the case in depression, where we often have a lot of negative thoughts going on in our minds, but also very true for right now. We're alone with our thoughts a lot more these days, and doing something that's pleasurable or that gives you a sense of mastery can help you get away from those negative thoughts. And of course, behavioral activation means being more active. So oftentimes it means using your body more, whether it's in the house or outside the house. And we know that physical health boosts mental health as well. And oftentimes behavioral activation goals can involve other people. Even now, in the limited context of social distancing, we can connect with others online. And we know that reducing social isolation bolsters our moods and also very much helps with depression. A great way to actually keep track of activities that can positively boost our mood is to do so in a form of a log or a diary format, or in CBT, what we call an activity schedule. And I've put an example of one here on the slide. It essentially looks like a calendar where you have every day of the week and every hour of the day that you're awake listed with an associated activity that you did for that hour. I've only put about half of the day on the slide for the sake of space, but you would do this for every hour that you're awake. So if we took a look at the example of Sunday, we can see that this person slept in till about 9, then had a nice long breakfast, had an internet browsing session, maybe social media or some news, took a Zoom call with a friend from 11 to 12, then had a nice long lunch, and then started to Netflix after lunch at 1 o'clock. So you can see how this is split up across every day for including work days. And what's the important component here is that for each activity that you do, you can monitor your mood in association with each to see what the impact is of that activity on how you feel. And we can monitor this in terms of ranking our feelings of mastery or pleasure on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very little mastery or pleasure and 10 being the most. You can also rank your emotions in association with each activity. For instance, how depressed did I feel on a scale of 1 to 10 when I spent the afternoon watching Netflix versus when I got outside and did some gardening or yard work? The important thing here is that what activity scheduling can help us do is identify the activities that boost our mood, as well as the ones that kind of detract from our moods, and help us almost triage what we want to do a little bit more of versus a little bit less of. If I notice that after I watch Netflix or take a really long nap in the afternoon, I'm kind of feeling a little bit more down or depleted or depressed, maybe I want to do something else instead. Maybe I want to, do some dancing or some physical activity during that time. So again here, the main idea with activity scheduling is that it can help us to figure out the activities we want to do more of or less of because of the positive or negative impact on our mood. It can also help us to identify the people, the places, or the things that you want to increase or decrease, as well as the times of day that might be good for certain types of activities. So for instance, if you know that you're more energized and activated in the morning time, maybe you want to front load your day with your work if you have a flexible schedule right now. But that you notice later on in the day, you're feeling a little bit more down or sort of anxious or worried, maybe that's the time you want to schedule some physical activity or a call with a family member or a friend. So in this way, activity scheduling can also help formulate clear goals. If I see in my calendar, I really want to make sure I get that walk in, I'm going to put it in 3 times a week. And it can also provide motivation for activities, especially if you track your moods in association with each, by helping you see, okay, well, when I took that walk, I had, a ranking of depression that was, a 3. That was really low. So I want to do more of that. So that's basically the idea with some of these behavioral strategies that can be helpful, especially for symptoms of depression. That's the end of the content that I wanted to share with you about that today and about what the nature of CBT is and how we might apply it to depression. Now what we'll do is we still have a few minutes left, so we can open up the floor to some questions, and Dr. Foley and I will do our best to answer the questions if we can. So please type in your questions to that same Q&A box, and we will get to them as soon as we can. Okay. All right, so I'm going to take a look at the question box now and see if we have any questions. Apologies for the slow reply if that's the case. I'm monitoring all of these things. Okay, so we have a question which I'll read out now, and then maybe Dr. Foley, if you want to take a stab at answering this question. The question is, what do I do if I'm exhausted mentally and physically? How can I distract myself?
Hi. So, yeah, sorry, I'm not on video. I got all dressed up and everything. That's a very good question. When you're already quite exhausted mentally and physically, then I think one of the things to do is, like Dr. Jewett was talking about in behavioral strategies, is really aim for something that is really low effort, because if you aim for something that kind of feels like it's going to completely fix your mood, that's probably going to be too difficult to achieve if you're already feeling so depleted or so worn out. I would aim for things that are really relatively simple and maybe a little bit more geared towards self-care. So for some people, it could be taking a bath, even something as simple as having, a hot cup of tea or a tisane, or making a lunch that you like a bit more, but that's easy. Maybe now's not the time to try to whip up your famous recipe, but just doing something a little bit simple and that can maybe alter your mood ever so slightly, but more in the self-care direction.
Mm-hmm. And thanks so much, Dr. Foley. The related question that same person had asked is about making realistic goals. And how do I make realistic goals and not be so hard on myself? How much and how versus how little do I do?
Right. So that's a really great question. And I would say start with the smallest, almost insignificant thing you can imagine yourself doing. If it seems almost not that big a deal, that's probably just right. So one of the big mistakes that people make when they're feeling a bit down or depleted is they want to feel better so quickly that they aim a little bit too high. So if you can pick something and imagine that no matter how exhausted you are, even you can do that right now, then that's probably a good start. If it feels like it's going to take a little too much effort, then that's probably still a bit too high. And then you can build up from there, because one of the big things is that when you start really, really small, we like to sort of say no fail experiments. That kind of gives you something to work on, something to build on, kind of like a building block. So just like if you're teaching somebody to read, you don't start with War and Peace. You you teach them the alphabet first, and maybe if they can't master the whole alphabet, maybe you just start with ABC. So I would say the smaller the better, and then if you have success from that, that'll give you a bit more confidence to try something a little bit bigger.
Absolutely. And we had another question come up that I might just tag on to that about what if there's physiological components to the depression. So I'm assuming that might mean things like, maybe feeling extra fatigued or slowed down, lethargic. And I would say that, as Dr. Foley was mentioning, that's where it's really important to set goals to meet you where you're at and to listen to your body and to say, okay, maybe for me right now, just getting up and out of bed and, making my bed, making some food for myself, that's where I'm going to start. Or maybe it's taking a short 10-minute walk around the block. So it's really about, as we said, to set those goals for yourself that are reasonable, realistic, and attainable for you, so that you can get the chance to actually feel that sense of accomplishment after having successfully completed them.
Yeah, I like to say to people, if going for a walk around the block seems like too much, just getting dressed and opening your front door is a good start, you know?
Absolutely. Another question here that's come up is, how do I change my behavior when my whole experience of emotions makes me freeze?
Good question. So that might be a good example where if you find your emotions are so overwhelming that you're freezing, maybe starting with some of the thoughts, if you can identify some thoughts that might be leading to that freezing. If you notice that the freezing is maybe coming more from anxiety, then, maybe working out those thoughts when you're not in a kind of, high stakes environment might be some work you can kind of do in the background. Because you're right, if you're frozen, starting with the behavior is going to be pretty hard. So it's not going to meet our criteria of an achievable goal. So sometimes if this is something that's happened to you more than once, using that activity schedule might be a way to kind of notice a pattern. So do you always freeze around the same people or in the same situations? Is it always when you're feeling a certain way? And then you can maybe do some work on identifying, okay, so what led to this freezing response, and maybe start there.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we just have time for one more question. So apologies if we haven't gotten to all of yours. Someone asked, what can we do when alone time can't be found?
Ah, yes, well, that's a situation many of us are experiencing like never before. Like never before. It's a very good point. I would say often you can squeeze a little bit of alone time, even if you sort of have to steal it. So, maybe you steal it by going to the bathroom. That's a tried and tested and true trick of new parents. Or, after the kids are in bed, or after your partner's in bed, or maybe just taking 5 minutes at lunch. Often it seems impossible, but I guess, again, sometimes if you kind of look at your schedule, and you figure out what might be a good option for you, maybe it means setting the alarm 5 minutes earlier and taking those minutes. But good question.
Very good question. And it requires us all to become a little bit more creative than we might otherwise have intended, and how to find that alone time and what that means when we are in confinement, or we're spending a lot more time with the other people in our home that we wouldn't normally do. So it can be definitely a challenge that I think everyone can relate to. So thank you very much, everyone. Sorry if we couldn't get to all of your questions. I will wrap up just by noting that you can find on the website, the Jewish General Hospital's website for the psychiatry department, a list of additional resources that could be helpful for you at this time. on the website, you will also find information about the other webinars that are being offered as part of this series for you. And I would also invite you to please join us for our next CBT Stream webinar, which is next Monday, May 4th at 10 a.m., where we are going to be delving into a little bit more specifically how to identify, challenge, and change some of those unhelpful thinking patterns. So please sign up for that and join us for that webinar. And I want to thank you again for joining us today and for your fantastic participation and your comments and questions. Take good care, everybody, and stay healthy. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.